Hello, my name is TJ Buttgereit, and I'm a student here at Binghamton University of Binghamton. It is September 17, 2015, and I am interviewing lecturer Joe Schatz for the 2015 Astrobiology debates. Joe Schatz is a professor. He's a lecturer of English and Evolutionary Studies at Binghamton University and executive board member of the Institute for Critical Animal Studies. We are here today to discuss a topic that was prepared in partnership with NASA Astrobiology program, Resolved, an overriding ethical obligation to protect and preserve extraterrestrial microbial life and ecosystems should be incorporated into international law. All right, Joe, thank you for being here. The first question is, what expertise and experience do you have with the topic at hand?
Well, through the Institute of Critical Animal Studies, one of the things that I've looked into is valuing life and figuring out what sort of lives we give value to, and how sometimes microbial life, even though it's foundational to the way that life is formed, doesn't necessarily have intrinsic forms of protection as sentient forms of life. At the same time, I also serve as the director of speech and debate at Binghamton University. For several years, I engaged in doing policy research on space exploration policies and the way it would affect future exploration in space and what the discoveries could mean for us here on Earth as well.
Okay, so one of the questions, could you describe your understanding of microbial life and how you think it plays into the resolution?
Well, what's interesting about the resolution that it's phrased in terms of like an ethical obligation towards microbial life. And so microbial life would be lives essentially that we would be finding that NASA is currently finding on Earth, on the Moon, as well as in other places such as Mars, in order to figure out how that could then form the building blocks to other forms of life versus non-microbial forms of life form, like if there was silicon life. I think that this resolution excludes talking about like if there would be silicon life or like alien species outside of the microbial sector. So I think the resolution is trying to locate how we should debate about what it means for when we discover microbes on other planets and whether we should be harvesting them for further development or whether we should be respecting them for their own intrinsic worth.
So I think going back to kind of what you just said about intrinsic worth, what do you see an ethical orientation towards microbial life being? Like, what would having an ethical orientation, what would that look like for you?
An ethical orientation towards microbial being would be where when we encounter microbial organisms in either like elements of water or, as we explore with the other forms of technology and discover it, is that we should respect it in of its own right and not necessarily look for it as a tool that we can then utilize for our own gain. And so when we try and figure out what science we're going to develop from our discoveries in space, that when we conduct that science, we don't have just human interests in it alone, but we also focus on the interests of what it would mean for those microbial organisms and what it means for other organisms that may or may not exist.
And in the large scope of things, why do you think it is important? First of all, do you think it is important to have these kind of ethical oriented laws regarding microbial organisms, and why do you think it is important that these organisms be protected?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. I think that the reason why I think there should be an ethical orientation is because as we encounter other forms of life, when we haven't considered the value of that other form of life, we've been willing to destroy it without a second thought. And so I think of times of like colonialism, where when Western expansion would encounter forms of life that they didn't consider as being of value and allowed for indiscriminate killing or enslavement of those populations. And we see the same thing in the way that animals are treated, is that once we deem individuals and organisms as without value, that we're willing to exterminate them. So if we encounter microbial organisms in other planets and we think it's for our own gain, we'll end up destroying them without ever being able to figure out what they are intrinsically to themselves. And the reason for why I think that's important, there's sort of two, is that in the first instance, a lot of times if we harvest them for our own gain, we harvest them to the point of extinction, and those microbial organisms won't be around for us to learn future forms of thinking and figuring out how it could serve as the evolutionary building blocks to our forms of life or other forms of life. So we lose those new scientific discoveries we didn't harvest to extinction. And then second, science is constantly expanding what we understand as sentience and understand what we mean by by value and what sort of systems of pain that individuals and organisms can feel. So I think that we should always err on the side of caution and not necessarily not do anything with a microbial organism we find, but make sure that when we do things, we also take into account the intrinsic value of those microbial organisms in of themselves.
And now, in terms of valuing these organisms, how do you think that valuing them and having an ethical orientation towards them weighs against the practical inconveniences that could come up by doing, like in terms of how exploration is conducted? How do you think those two weigh, and like why would you think an ethical orientation would be more important in not being able to explore in certain circumstances?
Right. I mean, that's a very good question, because the counterpoint to this resolution is really that microbial life shouldn't have an ethical orientation to it, and instead we should view it utilitarian, and we should figure out and do what we want with it. And certainly, if we wanted to like terraform, it's much easier to not care about the organisms that are already there and just level it for our own needs and gains and be able to harvest it. So there's a lot of reasons for why, if there wasn't that ethical obligation, we'd be able to explore quicker or settle other planets quicker. I think the argument against that is that when we do that, we again lose the ability to get future discoveries, because we've then indiscriminately killed those organisms and have wiped them out, opposed to figuring out how those organisms have survived on those planets. I believe that one of the keys to actually being able to successfully, jump the rock and be able to set up space colonies means that we also have to understand how life could survive in planets that are not Earth. And so by preserving those organisms, even if we don't understand how they're able to live currently, by preserving them, we're able to continue the scientific discoveries that make space exploration better in the long run. So I think that that's a utilitarian answer to the argument that we need to just not have that orientation.
And another thing I'm curious about, on Earth even, there are millions of organisms that we have yet to discover here. And so in the context of exploring other planets and, exploring beyond Earth, what do you think is kind of like the threshold for exploration in terms of finding out whether or not there is life on a planet, and then determining like how we should treat that life that could possibly exist, but we don't know if it does in fact exist?
Well, that's one of the questions where I think we have to proceed with a precautionary principle and make sure that we do not know if life does or does not exist. We have found hints of life in planets just in our immediate solar system. And so the fact that there's infinite possibilities out there certainly means that there's almost undoubtedly a fact that we will encounter other forms of life form, whether they be fully sentient or whether they be just sort of like microbial, like bacterial organisms. These are organisms that do exist and that we found some evidence of. And so we have to figure out what should we do as we engage them, so that way in the event that we might encounter another sentient extraterrestrial organism, it becomes important to have ethical parameters for how we deal with them prior to those forms of encounter. And I think that is important even if extraterrestrials don't exist, because we still have to pay attention to those smaller microbial organisms that do, instead of drawing a line over what we should ethically consider.
Okay. And so in context of the resolution of the exploration, do you think, you mentioned terraforming before? Obviously, there are a lot of advantages to terraforming. You mentioned getting off the rock, and so do you believe that that getting off the rock, if we find that we need to do it in the near future and can do it at the expense of microbial organisms, you would believe that we shouldn't do that in preserving those microbial organisms?
Yes, I think that our desire to be able to leave planet Earth and find another planet, I think that in some sense there is impending disasters that for human species to exist through the end of time, it would be necessary to get off planet Earth at some point. I don't think that there's an impending danger where we need to start space colonization rapidly. So I don't think that the desire to colonize space should come at the expense of existing organisms. I think that there's a better symbiotic relationship where we could explore space, settle other planets, but in that process of settling, not turn it into another phase of colonialism, but do it in a way that would be truly symbiotic. And in order to do that, we need to have the ethical orientation that allows us to be able to take those organisms as valuable in their own right. And again, that doesn't mean that we can't do things with those organisms, but then when we consider what we're doing with the organisms, we're also considering that organism's own, value in of itself, just like we consider our own value in of itself and our own worth. We have to take that into account of the other. And by doing that, I think it'd be create a more effective solution that would actually be able to get us ability to leave the rock sooner, because it means that we are understanding how life exists, opposed to just saying it has to exist this way and leveling things.
So you believe that there's actually a practical benefit to having this ethical orientation rather than just a ethical or moral one, and that it can actually help us explore better because we have this orientation towards these organisms?
Certainly. I think that one of the things that prevents certain individuals from being able to figure out an effective way to colonize other planets is the belief that life can only exist under the conditions that exist on Earth. And I think if that we're able to look at other organisms and how they're existing in other situations, just like we have looked at other organisms that exist on Earth, underwater, and other places, that it becomes ways that we can figure out how life could function differently. And through those scientific discoveries, we're better suited to actually be able to explore space. And I think that's an independent reason from the desire to always try and include increased lenses of ethical compassion, opposed to being more restrictive in what we say we should consider. So I think that there's two distinct arguments, both that are valuable in their own right.
Right. And I mean, just in closing, would you give a brief? Obviously, I think you made clear what side of the resolution you're on in your own personal opinion. Would you give a brief summary of what you think is the most important issue coming as when you approach this question, in terms of what you think the focus should really be on when we approach this resolution?
Yeah, I think for the debaters in this resolution that they should be focused on what it means to have an ethical orientation. What is ethical? Because utilitarianism is a form of ethics. And so I think affirmative teams would be able to say that we should be able to have a utilitarian relationship with microbial organisms and still affirm the resolution. I think other teams, or people like myself, come across the term of ethical as having intrinsic deontological value, and so that way that there's a value in preserving the individual organisms for their own intrinsic worth, opposed to a utilitarian reason, even though I believe that there are utilitarian reasons for why we should have that ethical orientation as well. I think that then the second major issue that debaters should be focused on is, what is microbial life? Does microbial life only mean like individual microbes and bacteria, or could it also mean larger forms of life that have yet to be discovered? And I think that's an area that could be explored. But I also think that if microbial life only ends up being about things like bacteria and microbes, then it becomes harder for the affirmative to defend ethical orientation as deontological, because there's yet to be sentience established in bacteria organisms. But certainly there is a host of literature that would defend that position as well. And I think that those are the two major issues in the debate, because the debate does not question about whether we should be exploring space or whether we should be doing these discoveries, but it seems to be questioning more of what orientation should we take as we further space exploration. And I think that it's trying to get at the heart of the relationship of what we see humans' role in the greater universe, opposed to just terrestrial organisms.
All right. Thank you, Joe. I appreciate you doing this interview with me.
Thank you for giving the time.